really brief to say I'm so much looking forward to what their findings, starting first with really was appreciated the opportunity to partner with you all again, because in this project in particular, this is the third project I've had the privilege to work with Middlebury College on, but this one was really looking at, we are in the midst or need to be in the midst of a significant energy transformation, as we know, and in that transformation there are likely to be winners and losers. Is my hope, and I'm coming from the fundamental space of 620,000 people in the state of Vermont, the people who deliver our fuel oil, keep us warm, they are our friends and our neighbors. How do we help support this transition? And by understanding where our fuel sector is and who's innovating, what they're doing, how are they doing it, how can we help them scale up? If they're not, why not? And how might we also help them diversify to begin to move off of fossil fuels, become more diversified in their business planning. So really just thank you guys so much for this really great work, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Okay, so as Joey and Jan said, we are Middlebury College students. I think you've probably gotten that by now too. I'm Matt. I'm John. Ben.
Hey.
And we'll be talking about the thermal energy future here in Vermont. So you saw this graphic on the last presentation. It's from the Energy Action Network's annual report. And this is the sphere that we're looking into. Almost literally. Although what I would say is that, so when you first look at it, you're like, okay, 80% of this is non-renewable. And the slice of the graph that isn't there is that over 70% of that 80% comes from one industry. So what's the state of Vermont's delivered fuel industry? That's basically what we were looking for. And we didn't come in with too many expectations. We wanted to hear from these people. From the, we're sort of outsiders kind of parachuting in as Middlebury College students, and we wanted them to speak for themselves. So without further ado, before we speak for us, we want them to speak for them.
It's a wonderful business, and one that I'm very proud of, and one that we really bend over to take care of our customers.
We're here to help, and we're here to reduce fossil fuel usage and the cost of the customer. They are looking at trying to wean the state off of fossil fuels. However, that's kind of a detriment to us.
Yeah, carbon tax, we can talk about that. The day that they test for carbon tax is the day I sell.
I think going forward, let's face it, everything's changing. The world's changing. We've got to do a lot.
There's a lot of opinions there. And it made it really exciting for us. I will say that. So this is the outline of what you're going to be hearing today. We're going to briefly go over our methods. We're going to characterize the two sort of main business types that we see within the industry. We're going to talk a little bit about the philosophies and the corresponding policy perspectives that fit a little bit into their business decision making. And then we're going to have sort of 3 sets of barriers to the renewable transition, and then 3 corresponding recommendations that we see. Then hopefully we can tie it all together. So real quick, here are our methods. Basically what we did is most of our research was sort of around interviewing folks. And the first phase of interviews were folks who we considered broad perspectives, experts in related fields. There were 7 of those. And then we dived into sort of the brunt of our analysis, which was sort of speaking to and talking with fuel energy service providers. There were 13 or 14 of those, about 25 hours of interviews. And this graphic here, Vermont. And those dots represent sort of the locations of the businesses that we talked to. We really tried to get sort of a good geographic spread and not just Addison County where we were. Okay, so if anything, this is what we really like you to lead with. We're trying to tee this up ahead of time. Firstly, there are a whole host of industry issues that apply to any of the businesses that we spoke to, regardless of their offerings. But those barriers are also barriers to renewable diversification. Some of the barriers that might prevent some of their business for delivering home heating oil are also the same barriers that are preventing them from installing cold climate heat pumps. They're related. Secondly, customer relationships are their primary asset. When we're talking about consolidation in the industry, what other businesses are buying them for are for their customer base. And so that's a relationship that, there's just a lot, it's just really valuable. And if customers ask for renewable heat, these businesses will take it seriously. And lastly, there's kind of this really, we're framing it as sort of a communication gap. And within sort of relationships that we were sort of surprised do not exist. A lot of the folks, the businesses who are already transitioning don't speak to each other. And they're not speaking to some of the folks in related sectors that could aid in their transition. And so we see this as a real opportunity.
And so we've been talking a little bit about these sort of two different business models, but really what they are, they're business models in relation to this energy transition that we're all seeking to achieve. And so the terminology we're going to use to describe those two different business models are fuel distributors and energy service providers, and of course in relation to renewable energy services or products. So these are the characteristics that we observed in businesses that are already trying to transition or perhaps have made more efforts to that end. And they tend to have pretty robust HVAC and plumbing service divisions. They don't just deliver fuel. They will primarily service residential customers, but also have significant interest in commercial customers like gas stations. There's no one fuel that they offer. So, any given business will be servicing, the needs of the area they're servicing. Though, as you'll see, heating oil is still the primary fuel type. Geographically speaking, they tend to service multiple counties, or at least parts of multiple different counties. And diversification for them, they perceive it, and diversification into newer renewable technologies, they perceive it as good business strategy. They perceive it as part of their business's future. On the other hand, we have businesses that are not currently transitioning, or it's just sort of out of their purview. And there are two different types of businesses that fall within this category. There are small businesses who primarily deliver distillate fuels, and they service the equipment that burns those fossil fuels. But then there's also multi-state corporations, people like Irving, Suburban Propane, that while they might be offering things like cold climate heat pumps, they still have significant interest in maintaining their distillate fuels business. And so for the smaller businesses, generally the cost and basically risk associated with transitioning to delivering more, renewable services and products are seen as too great of a business risk, where it's just too much effort. And then for some of the larger folks, it's basically, it's seen more committing to diversification and committing to providing more of those products they already provide is another form of business risk, just framed differently.
So, sure. To illustrate some of the philosophies and rhetorics behind these fuel dealers and energy service providers, we thought we'd dive into some quotations. So the way the state talks about the oil industry, they don't put a positive spin on it. They don't give us credit for what we do. So that quotation is kind of getting at a general feeling of sort of vilification of fuel dealers, fuel oil by the state, sort of lack of recognition for the service that they provide, which is something that they take pride in, providing warmth to Vermonters. And that sort of works into the rhetoric behind kind of customer affordability. They feel like state regulation might make it harder for people to stay warm in the winters. So that's what this quote is sort of getting at. Affordability of comfort is a huge, huge deal for me. Pretty straightforward. Another thing, interestingly, that we noticed was sort of environmental neutrality / pro-environmentalism. People are for renewables, for the environment, but sort of policy partisan. So when it comes to state policy, sort of following along party lines and not wanting kind of democratically associated environmental policy to be passed. I think this quote gets at that, so I don't think Phil Scott, is trying to undermine us in any way, but the governor obviously is limited concerning the House and Senate is democratically controlled. So Phil Scott identified, he's worked as a fuel, I guess, like a delivery driver, Republican. So that's one thing we noticed. Also, along sort of party lines is carbon misinformation, sort of like a disconnect between understanding like what really is a carbon footprint. And this quote gets at that. The industry has gone to low sulfur, so we're not leaving much of a carbon footprint. Like this person who I talked to kept stressing, like we have cut down our sulfur, but obviously that is not a contributor to carbon footprint. So there's this sort of disconnect, and that I think is one reason why people feel like the CEP misrepresents their carbon footprint. So getting into policy perspectives that informs the comprehensive energy plan, most of the people we talked to thought that it was unrealistic, but to varying degrees. These quotes illustrate that. The state's goal of being 90% renewable is, I think there's no way in hell they'll achieve that. A little more moderate is, I think that common sense would have been 50% at that point in time. And even more, just a different perspective, I guess, is the 2025 goal is probably not going to be met unless there are huge technology changes. So sort of people agree that renewables and fossil fuels have a place in the state's thermal energy portfolio, but disagree regarding the proportions and timeline and means to get to those goals. Regarding the carbon tax, very few, if any, supported it, primarily because of customer affordability, and secondarily because they thought it might be bad for business. And I'd like to recognize here that these are perspectives, and that there have been efforts, of course, to make customer affordability, well, to make a carbon tax more affordable, but we feel that maybe there's just like either a lack of awareness or sort of the fuel dealers might not think that those efforts are enough. And another thing, sort of already feeling nickeled and dimed by the various fees and taxes that are already in place in Vermont for fuel dealers. And so when we've reframed the carbon tax as sort of a fund managed by fuel distributors, maybe through the BFDA, people were tended to be more receptive, but also skeptical, saying like I would have to look at the numbers on that, kind of like not really knowing what that would look like, but willing to sort of consider it. And this is a quote that gets at the customer affordability. It's more about the consumer and not the delivery person. So we should be whole, other than just making it harder for folks to pay their bills. Pretty straightforward.
So the last policy we want to talk about is policies concerning weatherization and efficiency programs. This is really surprising to us, what we found. Sort of both business types, almost everyone we spoke to was really fairly supportive of weatherization programs, even though if you weatherize a home, it's going to require less fuel. So that directly hurts and cuts into their bottom line. Some quotes that correspond to that is that it doesn't matter what you heat with, keep the heat. And then the state just got rid of the rebate program for propane and oil furnaces as of September 1st. They want to redirect the money towards insulation and weatherization, which I'm totally in favor of. So this is another reason why this is fascinating is that the weatherization fund is financed by the fuel tax, formerly the gross receipts tax, which is a tax, and we've been talking, and we sort of followed this up in our interviews shortly after talking about the carbon tax. So it's fascinating the distinction between something that's heavily partisan like the carbon tax and something that perhaps not as much so like the weatherization fund. And this maybe is an opportunity considering the losses and wastes that correspond to building thermal uses right now, could be an area to ramp up, to decrease carbon with by increasing taxes and increasing this fund and what this fund can do without sort of the partisan weight of the carbon tax.
One of the primary barriers that we identified in these businesses is labor supply. just difficulty finding qualified employees, especially drivers, plumbers, electricians, trained employees. And so that has kind of given rise to competition for labor, for smaller businesses, unable to provide the same wages, benefits, etc., going out of business, leading to acquisitions. And another thing is that lack of, I guess, qualified, especially service technicians, has been an obstacle for businesses adding business lines. Like, you never know who you're going to get, like the quality of the service technicians that you're going to get if you try and expand into that, and that can hurt your business reputation. Is basically what we gleaned from that. So this quotation gets at sort of, trend, an ongoing trend that seems to be deepening. The problem is this younger generation is not getting into it. And I've got electricians who come in because we do a lot of heat pumps and generators, and they'll come in and say, you know, any kids, young kids who want to learn, I need help. I need bodies, like literally just bodies. So it's young people not being interested in kind of blue-collar jobs these days.
And so another aspect of this, so energy service providers are already providing heat pumps, but they've sort of seen heat pumps as supplemental sources of thermal heat in a home. They do not see them as realistic ways to provide the primary heat source. And so they also have some concerns over the resiliency of electric heat. Basically, one of the perspectives we got a lot was that heat pumps are great, but we need to have a diverse fuel portfolio. We can't just rely on electric heat. And similarly, in tying into sort of, the last presentation we heard, there are concerns over the ability of Vermont's electrical grid to handle heat pumps if there is this widespread and, quick transition towards using them as primary heat sources in homes. And other than heat pumps, a lot of the fuel dealers and energy service providers we talk to, they don't see electrical heat, including advanced wood heat, which is a huge part of, the slated transition. They simply do not see a business opportunity for themselves there. And what this all leads to is a sentiment that there is no pressing need to diversify generally, because heating oil will always have a place in Vermont. And another quote that speaks to sort of their views on upcoming technologies: wood pellets aren't a get-rich-quick thing. I'll tell you that right now. It's a tough niche. So simply in the context of a plan that's looking to switch to using these forms of heat, they do not see a business opportunity there. So that leads us to our first recommendation. And sort of to tie these two together, both of these barriers, labor and these new forms of electrical heat, these barriers are both larger than energy service providers or the distillate fuels industry themselves. Labor will affect multiple different kind of trades, but especially this sector. And both will impact the ability and or desire of businesses to diversify into providing more renewable energy services and products. And with labor, it's particularly concerning because service technicians will be essential to providing more renewable services. An electrician and having one in-house will be an essential part of the formula in a business being able to comfortably transition. And so our first recommendation is to invest into the Vermont trades education system. And that'll allow, a new crop of young folks to come up and start working in this industry. And then also sort of getting into this larger theme of strategic electrification, this move towards more heat pumps, more advanced with heat, could be framed as part of this larger strategic electrification goal.
And our second barrier is fairly straightforward. It's customer focused. There's simply not enough customers who are starting their renewable heat conversation when you think about how powerful that conversation could be. So it sort of kind of goes without saying that any sort of service or relationship where you know the person who you're dealing with, that the customer is going to have sort of a large role in how that relationship plays out and the products that might be there. And the quality of service that you're getting. I was surprised how close these businesses are with their customers. A quick anecdote: there was a fuel dealer who, when he interviews for drivers, he specifically asked what they would do if someone asked them to change their light bulb, and the answer that he's looking for is, "You change that light bulb, you don't call me, And it gets into this thing that he talks about how folks have shoveled driveways for some of their older customers. He built a standing flower bed. I'm sidetracking here, but it's just like a really close relationship. And they consider them the most valuable business assets. And they don't say it like that, but it's true. It's their most valuable business asset financially. And those customers have a direct effect on diversifications of products and services. And this quote really gets at that. I've been selling biofuels since 1998, okay, and there was some snarkiness here. Before you even knew what it was about. And again, that was a customer that came to me and they said, I want to cut down on my carbon footprint. And I said, okay, I'm going to find a way for us to do it, or to do it for us. And it's this idea of us. I cannot stress that enough. So our second recommendation, use that existing relationship. It's pretty straightforward. And how we can sort of enhance that is sort of understand that these sort of new thermal heat systems that are more renewable are going to be an investment. And so customers need to understand that they're affordable. And they need to be able to say when they're talking to their energy service provider that I know that this is an affordable option, let's find a way to make this work. This is something I'm really for. So that they can bring something to that conversation and that the energy service providers aren't the only experts in the room. And part of that is just getting them the knowledge of financial incentives and information and increasing those financial incentives.
Right, so the third barrier that we were exploring is the one on relationships, and we thought that was very important because by exploring relationships, we could look at potential areas of collaboration, and we looked at 4 actors: the VFDA, fuel dealers, so fuel deliverers, or the whole group at large, the state, and the VNRC. And just to start with the VFDA, across the board, all of our energy service providers had a lot of great things to say about the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association, and they just really recognize that they do an amazing job at providing the services that they are supposed to provide. And this is a quote that kind of illustrates that. They do a lot of advocacy. They're very helpful in regards to this oil side of the business. And I think this quote kind of led us to really start thinking about the ways in which the VFDA isn't necessarily representing the whole of the fuel dealers, fuel deliverers, fuel energy service providers. And we think that there's a lot of potential there because what we realize is that the VFDA actually does a great job at providing training, at providing information, and at doing lobbying for fuel distillates very specifically. So for the product and not necessarily for the people. And the ones that we really are looking into, which are the energy service providers that have started to move forward and in their business, they're not necessarily being represented, and we think that there's a lot of potential there for collaboration between the VNRC, between the states, and these folks. The second actor are the fuel dealers themselves. Nothing much really came out of this. This quote kind of sums it up, very little conversation, and also remember that we're all in competition with each other. So it's kind of this dry space. People don't really organize around amongst themselves. So let's go talk a little bit more about the state. This is the most fraught relationship. I'm just going to start by reading that quote. I don't think that a lot of people who are coming to legislation live it. They don't understand what is happening on both sides of the aisle. They are one-sided over decision-making rather than compromise. And this is sort of getting at the idea that fuel dealers don't feel, fuel deliverers, energy service providers don't necessarily feel that the state is there to listen to them. The state has a very specific agenda that it's not agenda, but doesn't really make space for them, which comes back to the point of there is no table for these people to start voicing their concerns or start talking about their ideas. And the reason why we think that's, well, the second quote, some days I think they forget about the smaller people, is that they really care about their customers and they really care about affordability. And sometimes the decisions that the state is making kind of threaten that, at the same time sort of threatening their business with meddling. They feel like the state meddles a little bit too much on their business. And with the VNRC, this is the code that kind of illustrates that relationship. There is Vermont and there's Chittenden County, and one has no clue about the other. That is how I feel about the VNRC. I understand where they want to go in a perfect world, but for such a small state, it is amazing the lack of comprehension. And those kind of echo the sentiments that these folks that we interviewed have about the state. So state and VNRC have like very parallel. They're very parallel sentiments, and as we talked about earlier, these energy service providers are not anti-environment, and therefore a collaboration and a conversation isn't impossible. It just isn't there right now, and there isn't really a feeling that they could even begin to be heard because the agendas are so different. So in terms of recommendations, we just thought that it would be very important to establish avenues of dialogue. So across all the relationships, there are communication gaps that are not necessarily negative. They are potentials that can be filled and that we can tap into if we're trying to bring these folks into this conversation. And the problem about these communication gaps is that they focus on policy as restrictions instead of thinking about how policies can help diversification, which in turns can feed into the CEP goals. So there is this fake dichotomy that doesn't need to exist, that these actors can all work together if we start shifting the conversation a little bit. And also, one thing that we realize is that there is a lot of really good work being done by these energy service providers. They have great ideas, and as we said, a lot of their motivation is good business, like moving their businesses forward, and they have great ideas, and we know that because we've talked to them and they're doing it, and so we need to really create spaces where these ideas can become policy, these ideas can become actions towards the CEP, not these individual unorganized actions. So yeah, our recommendation is to create a working group outside of the EAN and the VFDA that brings together similar actors with emphasis on energy service provider, fuel distributor representation. And we really want to emphasize that these working groups need to be outside of those two existing spaces, because we don't, for example, for the EAN, you have to sign on to the CEP goals, like you really have to manifest your agreement for those goals for you to be a part of the space, and we don't think that that should be a condition for these folks to participate in the conversation at all. Like if they have ideas, they should be able to contribute them without having to state that they are for these very specific goals. Like, yeah.
And so, what does this all mean? And these kind of tie back to our original 3 recommendations, but any solutions pathway will likely favor energy service providers, those folks who already have service divisions, who are already, doing perhaps a lot of weatherization services. It will favor them. And that's due to both the business characteristics that we've mentioned and also personal philosophies regarding the role of renewable products and services in their business model. But even for those folks, like we said, we'll have to address barriers that are larger than the industry itself, and that will be essential to moving even these, folks that are already trying to transition, that are underpinning sort of this new business model that is being proposed. And with that comes sort of recognition that this needs to be reframed as part of a larger transition. And similarly, with number 2, we need to recognize, through this project, we've seen how important customers are to these folks. They're essential. And so if we can get customers to be part of this conversation, this could be a transformation that not only includes the business itself, but also the customers who use those services. which at the end of the day is all Vermonters. And perhaps most importantly, like Liam was getting to, there have to be new venues of dialogue. It seems that a general sentiment is that they've been left out of these conversations that will be directly affecting their businesses. And before we can address customer incentives, investing in the trades education, we have to make sure that the folks in this room are listening to the folks in the other rooms.
Yeah, so we have lots of acknowledgements. We could probably go on and on about our interviewees. They were so gracious with their time, and particularly during this sort of, with our energy service providers and fuel distributors, this is sort of coming up on their busy season when we were interviewing them, kind of in the thick of it now. Of course, to Joey, thank you so much. She checked in with us every week. Only when we dropped the ball did that not occur. And helped us all throughout the report, and we're really excited to sort of be coming into the home stretch of the report. Of course, to Professor Dan Suarez and to Diane, our advisor for the projects, and the NVS team, and environmental studies for our forthcoming diplomas. Thanks.
Richard Fazy, Energy Futures Group. So who, based on your research, who do you think should be the facilitator for this dialogue?
It's a really good question. Eileen, do you want to jump on that? That's what I'll do.
Well, can I add on to that? Like, particularly because in Vermont, like, we always run into the same people. So the people that you're talking about, like at VFT, like I'm talking to Matt Coda. He's brilliant. He's great.
He's super smart.
Super smart. So when you can get him to engage, it's terrific.
Yeah.
But he's in this really weird spot. So in a very limited space of people who are in a position to do that facilitation, like, not who, but like what kind of an entity do you think would be able to do that, to start that conversation?
So, I mean, part of that second recommendation is recognizing sort of, as Dan alluded to in the introduction, there's institutional sort of inertia. So that's why we specifically proposed doing it outside the EAN and the FDA, is to get away from the folks who have kind of been leading the conversation already. So, this is actually perhaps a question that, we haven't explicitly talked about as a group, but if I were to answer this question, I would probably choose somebody who's already providing, increasing amounts of heat pumps, of weatherization services, who's looking to diversify further so that they can lead the conversation from a point of view that's, not directly represented already.
Yeah.
But that, also they're the kind of person who's going to have connections in the industry to talk to folks who maybe perhaps haven't already been doing that. Because, while we framed this as, certain policies might favor these people who are already doing things, there's no need for this to mean this. That does not imply that they're the only ones who are going to be brought along this transition. That's not the goal. The goal is to bring everybody along, and obviously I think that talking to the folks who did this out of their own initiative, I think they would probably be the best leaders from what we've seen. But that's just my personal answer.
I do want to say too, part of that sort of third recommendation is just understanding that there's a lot of best practices already known from the work that the energy service providers are doing. And there's just not a lot of cross-pollination of ideas going on. So whether it's an existing institution that facilitates that conversation, or whether it's just establishing a space for field dealers for energy service providers to speak amongst themselves and to share those best practices, which I think it sounds like they haven't done, even though they're in competition with each other. I think they'd be really willing to do that. That's sort of what we were getting at too.
I kind of want to echo what John said. I think that maybe having the state or having an existing entity that already comes with a lot of baggage is not necessarily the most effective way to do this, because people have already associations with the VNRC and with the state and opinions about it, and definitely having folks in the industry that are being innovative to like start bringing other people along is the way to go. But I think the idea is to have a space where everybody has a say in it. It's all these actors.
I do want to share one quote, or one idea from one quote too. One of the most sort of forward-thinking energy service providers, well, I guess I'm almost not forward thinking, but in terms of like what their sort of their offerings are, he no longer even sells home heating oil, and that was a business decision. But what he says, he was talking about Matt Cota, and it's like Matt Cota and the FDA is smart enough to sort of go to these meetings to be part of the AN, to talk with the VNRC, to have those kind of collaborations, but he doesn't, I mean, you guys know there's not that comes out of that, and you know, Joey, in our conversations, that was sort of a part of this process, so that we don't have a lot of baggage, so we can break a little bit of those barriers. So it's a tough question, it's a good question. It's slightly outside of the, yeah.
One last thing, what about an academic institution?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know,
Probably.
I don't know.
It's open to you guys because we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of like what our solutions would look like. They were mostly like overarching ways of moving forward. So I don't know. Do you think that academic institutions could do that?
I sort of had a follow-up question on that, which was the point you raised about competition versus wanting to learn from each other. And do you have recommendations for how someone would frame this discussion in a way that would encourage people to share their best practices, even though they might be seen that as like giving away their trade secrets?
Yeah, I would say,
well, I think that there's sort of an implication there that, you know, it's one or the other. I mean, I think that competition, yes, of course. You know, there's also a fair amount of, you know, networking that goes on through the transactions they already do. So, for example, from a larger field dealer selling to a smaller field dealer, it's not exactly cutthroat. So, you know, I'm not sure if I have a certain recommendation similar to the last question, but, you know.
I would.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have something that I would say is that it's not something that has as much competition between, like, labor supply shortages is something that they are really pissed off at each other about in terms of larger companies sort of poaching their people. So when it's framed in terms of some of the energy, when it's just like the energy service providers that would be coming to that table, and when there can be collaboration, and perhaps that can also be an avenue to talk about ways that they can collectively address the labor supply issue. Which is something that has a real clear cut, because I was got to the point where one of the folks that I spoke with says, I just gotta do this in-house. I gotta train them up, I gotta do everything, because the system is not training out enough folks for me to latch onto. And that's a missed opportunity. And that's something where you can, I think they would come to the table for that and then talk about best practices for the renewable transition. Yeah.
Hi, can anybody hear me? This is Alex at the Agency of Ag.
Also call in. So for our live stream, we can hear you, Alex.
Yes, voice from the room.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Very interesting. I nominate Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. I would certainly be willing to sit in on that, especially if there's anything that involves alternative fuels that are related to our working lands in Vermont, such as, for example, Vermont-produced biodiesel, which I would think the fuel dealers see as a pretty nice drop-in option. It had some favor a while ago, and it's, you know, a little easier than training their people on wood pellets or electricity. So anyhow, that would be my organization, and one in which I would be glad to sit down with to have that kind of a convening.
Well, we'll give you some numbers, I suppose.
Yeah. Sorry.
Scudder Parker, I wondered, as you talk to the dealers, this industry had gone through huge consolidation. Lots of small local dealers bought out. I assume that there are some who are much more local businesses and some who are just vendors, deliverers of the fuel, and that has to do in part with the nature of their connection to the supplier that they're selling for. I don't want to go into that discussion because it's beyond this, but I'm sure it's one of the driving forces in some of the behaviors you see from the dealers that you talk to. Did you sort of disaggregate that some in your thinking a little bit?
Absolutely. So acquisitions and talking about that in this presentation is something we went back and forth on because it certainly has been a driving force at various points in the industry, particularly in the 90s and around when fuel spiked in 2008. One of the things we noticed is that it's not necessarily, one of the things we looked at is, this is an older industry. So, these folks, a lot of, we sent out a small survey to some of our folks and, it's a lot of, 55 plus, 65, 70. And so that could be a driving factor in terms of how they're thinking about this because, if you're not going to hand off your business, then there's no need to invest in a whole new side of it.
Right.
And if there are folks who are interested in buying your customer base, then there's no need to invest in hiring an electrician. So there are certainly business characteristics, both with the owners, with their perceived future of their business, if they're handing it off to a son or daughter, or anybody, it's certainly a factor, and it's a complex one at that. So it's one that will, like you said, it could be a function of purely the economics. Are they making enough margins at this point in time? Because it's sort of a year-to-year business sometimes. Anything. So it's a complex issue, and it's one that we're going to dig into in our report.
But the local distributor has an interest in diversifying. The oil company doesn't.
Yeah,
I would assume, but I'm postulating that.
Yeah, I would tack on that, and you're not far off. The nuance that I would put to that is that there's kind of a Goldilocks zone, and that's a little bit of what we were getting at in terms of the two different types and sort of characterizing them. So within the ones that are not transitioning, you have sort of really local dealers who are working within only a county or two predominantly. And then you also have the sort of distribution vendors, as you phrased it, for some of the big sort of multi-state, sometimes international, multinational groups. And both of those sort of interviews and those talks were where we didn't see as much interest in transitioning. From the bigger groups, we sort of got a little bit more of the canned answers. And from the lower ones, they're just like, I see a niche right now and just where I'm at, and I'm going to ride this train as long as I can. And something that I would also tag on to is a really fascinating thing with this sort of medium-sized energy service providers. So there's this, because we talked about this acquisition thing, there's sort of this non-hereditary aspect to it in terms of they're not looking to pass it on to future generations as much. They're just good business people. That's why they're transitioning, because they see it as a business opportunity. And folks who are willing to sell their business when they retire, because that's where they're nest egg and that's what they're building.
Last question.
Thanks. Dave Westman, Efficiency Vermont. I have more of a methodology question, which is that I find it really interesting that you decided to tackle this issue through a survey of fuel dealers, because I think there's just, if you start at that point of the EAN sort of data point of your study, which I imagine like your first class you guys are thinking like, how are we going to sort of tackle this? There's a lot of different ways that you could have approached it, right? You could have done consumer preference, you could have done economics analysis, you could have done a political analysis of fuel and legislation and carbon tax, which could have taken you to France, and the whole yellow vest thing going on. So how did you settle on what I think is a pretty unique and obviously very impactful study of very specific dealers in the state? It's just an interesting approach to it.
I'm going to punt one half of this answer to Joey. Because part of it was, I would say some of the methodology in your question was sort of what was built into this project when we signed up. So, and that came out through conversations with our professor, our project advisor, and Joey. If any one of you three wants to tackle half of that answer, that would be great. If not, we could pontificate up here.
Well, also our friend Richard Fazy in the room, we sort of based some of the ways we approach certain questions, the topics we asked about off of this 2012 report, as part of the Energy Futures Initiative. So I'd still like to pass it on, but we're also, in a sense, not directly, but we were sort of building off some work that's been done before.
I would just say, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, it's we are a small state, we have fuel providers who are our friends who, as Matt Curtis says, will show up on Christmas and keep you warm. And the goal is to figure out, what do they look like? What do they need? How do we help them? Because I think the state of Vermont, there could be policy, program, other kinds of constructs that would support them in diversifying, because we need to diversify is the fundamental point where I started from my seat in Chittenden County, apparently.
I would have in Washington County.
Yeah.
So we oh, go ahead.
Just the idea of this like communication gap that we were talking about is not something that we stumbled upon as we were reading or like going through our interviews. Like that's something that we kind of knew already from the start, that there were all these actors and they weren't talking to each other, and we did some broad perspective interviews, and then we realized that really the perceptions of the fuel dealers and what the fuel dealers think of themselves, everything is kind of meddled and there isn't that much communication. So like we wanted to know about the other side and we wanted to know from their perspective, as Joey said. So it's something that we kind of knew from the start.
The last thing that I would say is that we did something that I don't think anyone else in this room could do. It's just because we're college students. We don't really, and Dan was saying, we'd always say like, this is our best positioning tool. Like no one, and he was talking from his own experience, like, they're going to be more open to us.
I think you're right about that.
And I really think they were. Like a lot of these conversations, I would have loved to have like over a beer in a bar. It was that kind of just rapport. And we should really close by saying like everyone we spoke to was just like, they're just really good people.
Yeah.
And we're really fortunate that Joey had the vision to see that they need to be part of this conversation.
Is the funding inadequate to cover the beer?
No comment.
I owe you guys a beer. Beer on me. One last quick question.
Yeah, I had just.
You guys want to start bringing up your presentation over you?
I had dispensation for one quick question. Garrett Johnson, DEI, first time I said that. One thing I didn't hear, I found it fascinating though, was, it makes perfect sense to me with regards to the market-based business, thus listen to your customers if you want to survive. I know that.
Right.
I'm interested though, if you were surprised or to the degree it was revealed, the sense of urgency around climate change as a fundamental motivating purpose. And I'll just leave it there. Anything you'd like to say with regards to, I'm not sure where each of you brings to the table in terms of your conviction, the sense of urgency you have personally, but in terms of undertaking this, and you had these interviews with these great folks, could have had beer, maybe not, but did that surprise you? Do you think, I mean, if you want to mobilize people towards action, then there has to be either a common uniting inspiration or a common foe, typically. And I'm just wondering on your take on where you see that. If there's a continuum of understanding and sense of urgency, where is it?
I can talk about that from the customer. Businesses are definitely seeing customer trends towards more like environmental awareness, whatever. But I think from the business side, there's kind of like people we talk to are like, even renewables have their issues, and like it's more of a complex issue that we are participating in, but there's only so much we can do. So
I would say we had a survey that didn't really get off the ground because Matt Coda didn't back this project. No gripe there. But I will say, out of that, we had a question. Our two last questions were, do you think that it was filled out by most of the folks we interviewed. Do you feel that basically that renewables are sort of pushed too heavily in the state? And then talking about, do you think it's important for the state to move towards renewables? So the two sides of that. And the answer to the first one was yes, that it's pushed too much, and yes, that they're important. And what that gets at is that they're really, I think we have personal convictions. I know we all have personal convictions, but that didn't affect. We tried really hard for that not to affect our conversations. And particularly, it was really hard to hear carbon misinformation and echo. But I will say, out of that, they're doing it. They're what we said before. They're just doing it because it's good business. They see it as good business for them. They're not doing it because the IPCC report, the congressional report. Okay.
Yeah, but just because that is the case doesn't I don't think that's an invalidating argument. Like, that's their point of entry into this issue.
Yeah.
And if they don't feel a sense of urgency for climate change, are we gonna let them out of this conversation? That's just not smart. That's my personal point.
I think that's an excellent point. I was agreed. It's just more, you've been on the ground, you've been having these conversations. What a great opportunity to ask exactly if you're trying to gauge the temperament and the outlook of folks on that. That's what I asked.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
So we've taken up a lot of time, so I will say, if you guys want a wider, thank you. If you guys want a wider porthole into the fuel dealers, we can definitely make our report available to you. There are more quotes, there's more analysis. Thank you.